In this lecture, we're going to talk about more of the cardiovascular system. The heart contains a conduction system, and this allows heart muscle cells to contract. And with the conduction system, it allows them to contract in a regular, continuous way, and it also allows the cells to contract in concert. So that way, all of the cells contract together, which allows the heart to pump. There's special tissue within the heart that allows it to have all the cells contract simultaneously. So there's a structure in the right atrium called the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, and that's essentially the pacemaker of the heart. And then there's another structure called the atrioventricular node, and that's at the junction between the atria and the ventricles. And then there's the atrioventricular bundle, or the bundle of His, and it's in the interventricular septum. And then it branches, and then you have Purkinje fibers that spread within the ventricle walls. So this system talks to all of the cells of the heart muscle, and it allows them to contract together. So when the heart is pumping, the sinoatrial node is kind of the master pacemaker. And so that's the structure that tells the muscles to contract, and that signal is sent to the muscles through the AV node and then through the atrioventricular bundle and then out to the Purkinje fibers. So when the heart contracts again, the initiation is through the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, and it causes sequential stimulation, and it forces cardiac muscle to depolarize in one direction. So it always depolarizes from the atria to the ventricles. So once the sinoatrial node starts a heartbeat, the impulse spreads first to the AV node, and then the atria contract. So that's the first step. So when atria contract, they force blood to move from the atria into the ventricles. Then at the AV node, the impulse passes through the AV bundle, and then through the bundle branches and the Purkinje fibers, and that's when blood is ejected from the ventricles because they contract, and then the blood goes out through the aorta and pulmonary trunk when the ventricles contract. And they had filled when the atria contracted. So if we go back to our picture again, the sinoatrial node is what causes the initial contraction to occur, and the atria contract first. That forces blood to travel into the ventricles, and then the signal goes through the AV node and through the AV bundle and through the Purkinje fibers, and that forces the ventricles to contract, and then blood can be forced out through the aorta or through the pulmonary trunk, which would go that way in the heart. If there's issues with the contraction of the heart, there's a few different things that can happen. So the first is a heart block, and that's when you have a damaged AV node, and it releases them from control of the SA node. And so it results in a slower heart rate because the ventricles contract at their own rate instead of in concert with the atria. Another thing that can happen to the heart is ischemia, which is when you have a lack of adequate oxygen supply to the heart muscle, so it's not able to contract as efficiently, or something called fibrillation, which is when you have a rapid and uncoordinated shuttering of the heart muscle. So that means that the muscle cells of the heart are not contracting together, and so that's why we have those things called defibrillators, and so it shocks the heart into asking those muscle cells to contract coordinatedly again, and that's what causes the heart to be able to start pumping again. Because if you have a heart in fibrillation, it can't pump because the muscle cells are not contracting together. You can also have irregular heart rate. So tachycardia is when you have a rapid heart rate, which means that you're resting, but your heart rate's over 100 beats per minute, which is too fast for a normal resting heartbeat. If your heartbeat is going over 100 beats per minute and you're exercising, that's no problem. That's very normal for your heart rate to go up when you're doing cardiovascular exercise. Bradycardia is when you have a slow heart rate, and it's when it's less than 60 beats per minute. And so if it's too slow or too fast, that can be a problem. Next, we'll talk about the cardiac cycle and the heart sounds and how that relates to blood pressure. So when the heart is pumping, first the atria contract simultaneously, and then they relax, and the ventricles can contract. And when you are taking blood pressure, there's two numbers. There's one number on the top and a number on the bottom. And so systole is when the heart is contracted, which is a high number, which makes sense, right? Because there's more pressure in the blood vessels. And then diastole is when the heart's relaxed. That's the lower number in a blood pressure, And that makes sense also because there's less pressure in the vessels when the heart is not actively contracting. So over the next few slides, we'll go over all of the steps of a complete cardiac cycle. So during mid to late diastole, pressure in the heart is low, and this is when blood is flowing passively into the atria and into the ventricles. So it's basically refilling. The semilunar valves are closed, and the atrioventricular valves are open so that blood can flow from the atria into the ventricles. And at the end of this, the atria contract, and that forces blood into the ventricles. The next step is ventricular systole, and so this is when blood pressure starts to build before the ventricles contract. And here the atrioventricular valve closes, and that causes the first heart sound. So if you've ever listened to a heart through a stethoscope, it has kind of a 2-beat lub-dub sound. And the lub sound is when the atrioventricular valves are closing. That prevents blood from going backwards from the ventricles into the atria. During this phase, the semilunar valves open because blood is pushing against them, and blood travels out of the ventricles through the pulmonary trunk and aorta, and here the atria are relaxed because they contract before the ventricles contract. During early diastole, so at the end of systole, all 4 valves are briefly closed at the same time, and the second heart sound that you hear is the semilunar valves closing. That's the dup sound. So then the atria can finish refilling because pressure in the heart is dropping when the muscles relax. The ventricular pressure is then low after it's pushed blood out of the heart, and the atrioventricular valves can open again to allow a new cycle of blood flowing from the atria into the ventricles. So next we can go over this process with pictures if it's hard to imagine it when I'm just talking about it. So during mid to late diastole, this is when the heart is relaxed and the ventricles and atria are filling. So blood is flowing into the heart and it's flowing from the atria into the ventricles, as you can see there. At the end of diastole, the atria are going to contract, so they're going to push more blood into the ventricles. And it's important to notice that there's some valves here that are closed because you don't want heart to flow backwards into the ventricles. Then during ventricular systole, the ventricles can contract. So we've got, you can see the arrows denoting that right now. And then you can also see that blood is going to be able to be pushed out of the ventricles through pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Notice also that while the ventricles contract, the atrioventricular valves are closed, and then the atria can start to refill. And then finally, you can see the atria are starting to refill quite a lot now, and eventually when the ventricles relax, blood is going to be able to flow back into the ventricles from the atria, and then we're back to mid to late diastole. Next we'll talk about cardiac output. So cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by each side of the ventricles of the heart in 1 minute. Stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped by each ventricle in one contraction. So that's every single heartbeat. And that usually remains about constant. It moves about 70 milliliters of blood out of the left ventricle with each heartbeat. And typically, heart rate is about 75 beats per minute in an average adult. Certainly there's some variation there, but that's average. So you can calculate cardiac output by multiplying heart rate by stroke volume. So in an average adult, you've got about 75 beats per minute times 70 milliliters per beat, which means that a normal heart is pumping about 5,250 milliliters per minute. The more that the cardiac muscle is stretched, the stronger the contraction is. And so when cardiovascular activity is happening, like if you go for a run or a bike ride or whatever, you're probably going to increase your cardiac output. And that's partly because your cardiac output changes due to changing heart rate. And anytime you're doing cardiovascular exercise, your heart rate should go up. More than just exercise can increase heart rate. So the sympathetic nervous system can increase your heart rate. Like if you get really nervous, you might notice your heart rate goes up a little because you're experiencing some sort of crisis. Your heart rate also goes up if your blood pressure is low. Hormones also have an effect on heart rate. So epinephrine and thyroxine specifically can increase heart rate. Exercise can increase heart rate, and decrease blood volume also can decrease heart rate. Your heart rate will drop if your parasympathetic nervous system is active. Remember, that's the rest and digest division. High blood pressure and high blood volume can decrease heart rate, and also decreased venous return can decrease your heart rate. So in this slide, our last slide, this is just sort of all of the different ways that your heart rate and cardiac output can be impacted, because there's many different factors, right? So you might have some sort of crisis, so that can activate the sympathetic nervous system. You might exercise, which increases your heart rate. So there's many different ways to impact your cardiac output.